So, what else do we have that affects forest ecology and all the living and non-living factors? And that's going to be the climate. The climate's going to be huge in terms of its interaction with the forest environment. So let's talk about the general climatic and weather patterns within California. So when we're talking about climate versus weather, climate is our long-term weather patterns. What we usually refer to as weather is the short-term weather patterns. And when we talk about climate, we're specifically talking about things that have happened for multiple decades. The climatic weather patterns that we see are largely a result of the Pacific Ocean. So what happens is that basically the ocean influences all of our weather patterns because we got the moist air from the oceans rising up and cooling and condensing as it rises. And so because of the topography and because of the ocean and then the air coming off of the ocean, we end up getting these different precipitation patterns and different temperature changes as a result of the airflow moving from west to east. So you can see that here in this top left corner, we can see how our temperature changes as we go up with our topography and as we go up in elevation. You'll also get a lot of rain shadow effect. And what that is that as the moist air rises down here in this bottom left of your screen, as the moist air rises, it's going to come together. And as that air comes together, all the water droplets start to come together, and that's how you get clouds forming. And as it rises and rises and you get more pressure, finally there's so much pressure that it then lets go, and that's how we get precipitation. But what happens is we end up getting precipitation, as you can see in this picture down here. We get precipitation on the western side of these slopes. So we get it on the west side, and then as we go over the slope, what happens is now that the air can go back down and doesn't get that pressure, we don't get that precipitation. So we end up getting hot air coming through. So you see less rain in the Central Valley than you do on the coast. You also see rain again then on the in the Sierra Nevadas more than you do in the Central Valley, but then you get really not much rain in the Great Basin. And so this is how you get these areas of extensive forest cover versus these rain shadow areas like the Central Valley and the Great Basin. But what's nice about the Central Valley is because there's such great soil here, a lot of loamy soil, that it's great for grass and for agriculture because we do get enough precipitation in the Central Valley that we'll get grass and we'll get shrubs. We just don't get trees the way that you'll find near the coast and then when you get to the Sierras. So just kind of painting that picture again, the idea of the rain shadow. So this is Saline Valley in Death Valley National Park. And you can see the snow on the top of the peaks. And that's important because snow is another form of precipitation. And you can see where the precipitation stops and then working its way down. You see that that's that rain shadow effect. There's precipitation to a point, and then eventually it disappears. And so you can see down here this idea of what's called orographic lifting, or the idea that our air is trying to rise and get over the mountains. And so we get that pressure built up here, we get the water, the precipitation to happen on this side, but then once you get over the mountains and you get the hot air, but you don't get any of the precipitation, and that's how you get a rain shadow, and you end up with this on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So that means that the amount of precipitation that you get in your ecosystem becomes important. And not only does the amount of precipitation, that you get, but the timing and the form of the precipitation being largely determinant in what species grow in what areas. In some areas, you can get less than 10 inches. That's how you classify a desert, is less than 10 inches of precipitation. To then on the coast, some places get 200 inches of rain a year. Bakersfield, it averages about 6.5, 7 inches of rain per year. So not a whole lot because we're in that Central Valley rain shadow. And the other form of precipitation that becomes important is the snowfall. And we get a lot of snowfall in the higher elevations of the Sierras, and that becomes an important form of precipitation because it stays around for a while, it sits on the ground, soaks into the ground, helps build our groundwater storage, and then also becomes important for the summer growing season, because when spring starts to come around and the temperatures get hotter, the snow starts to melt, and that's how our drainages and our watersheds, like the Kern River, become filled up with water for the summer growing season. And then with all areas, you can get a lot of local climates and microclimates. So if you have a riparian area, if you've got all sorts of different slopes, if you get inversion layers, which is where you get a random temperature pattern. So the idea is as you go up in elevation, it gets colder, but sometimes you can hit an inversion where you go up in elevation and it gets warmer, and that's a change in air pressure, and because of that change in air pressure, you can get different temperature shifts and different pressure shifts. And so you can have some of these different local climatic patterns. Sometimes you'll hear people say stuff like sometimes when they say it's going to be raining, it's always raining on the other side of town. And it's things like that that kind of make it hard and difficult for people to understand climatic patterns, because they see it more as random and not pattern. But when you look at it at a 20-year clip, a 50-year clip, a 100-year clip, certain patterns definitely hold true. Like here, in the summers, you expect it to be 90 to 100 degrees. You expect it to not rain hardly ever. And, you can kind of start making predictions like that. It's just, things vary. You're going to find microclimates. You're going to find things that are exceptions to the pattern, but for the most part, the pattern stays the same. And so here's just kind of some examples of inversions to give you guys an idea of that. I just think that they're pretty interesting. The most obvious inversion for me is a marine inversion, because I grew up in the Bay Area, so I'm used to the San Francisco fog rolling over the foothills on the coast. And so that's what I usually think of when I think of inversions. So with ecology and with all these non-living factors that living and non-living factors that we've discussed in terms of the soil and in terms of the physical factors like topography and slope and aspect, and then the climate, we also have the living organisms within the forest community that we need to address to really make sure that we understand ecology. And so it's a good time to talk about biomes. So biomes are large naturally occurring communities of flora and fauna that occupy a major habitat like a forest or tundra. And these biomes are set by two climatic factors, by temperature and precipitation. And so it's basically a classification system to be able to take all the places in the world and get it down into, like a group of about 10 different biomes. So the whole world can be broken down into 10 different biomes just by grouping them by the amount of precipitation they get and by the temperature range that they're okay with. And so when we're talking about communities, we're talking about a group of interdependent organisms of different species growing or living together in a specified habitat. And so we're talking about plants and animals that are dependent on each other and that they are different, but they are living together in the same habitat. It's important to understand when we're talking about these biomes, talking about these communities, that plants and animals can only tolerate certain limited ranges in temperature and moisture. And so this is called the law of tolerance, where you have extremes of temperature and moisture, and you have a zone of physiological stress that determine whether a species can survive. So what does that mean? That means that animals are comfortable in a certain area, but as it gets hotter, or as it gets wetter, or as it gets drier, or as it gets colder, those animals will be less comfortable, and there'll be a less amount, to a point where you get to a spot where the animals won't live there because they can't handle it. A good, for instance, of that is just taking human beings. So human beings can live all over this planet, but human beings don't live on Antarctica, and human beings don't live at the top of Mount Everest. Human beings live in a lot of parts of it, but there are certain parts where there is such a stress on the human body that we can't live there. And the same happens with plants and animals. Certain ones have a really narrow range, and certain ones have a large range. Redwood is a tree that a lot of people are familiar with, but redwood, for it to thrive and for it to grow correctly, only can grow in a very narrow window of precipitation and temperature. If it gets too hot, redwood trees do not grow well. For instance, on the Bakersfield College campus, we've got some redwood trees planted. Now, those redwood trees get a lot of moisture from the sprinkler systems and all of that, but they're not the big 300-foot monsters that you see growing on the coast, or even the big 200-foot monstrous trees that you see growing on the coast, because redwoods aren't growing properly here. This is a zone of physiological stress for the redwood tree. It's not a zone of intolerance. It's not, the tree can't grow here, but it's going to struggle to grow properly here. It would be much happier on the coast, covered in fog, basically getting dripped on the whole time, and then that way it can grow to be 200 feet tall, because it's not that warm, and it gets rain constantly. So that's how they end up being 200 feet tall. So we said we can break our biomes down. So let's break our biomes down. Let's look at the whole world into these groups. And so if we look at just temperature and precipitation, so here's our temperature on our x-axis, our independent variable, and then we have our annual precipitation on our y-axis, our dependent variable. We can see these are the way that we break it down. So when we're talking about hot and we're talking about cold, we're talking about not a lot of rain and a lot of rain or snow. Okay, so we can get desert when we don't get a lot of rain and it's hot. When we don't get a lot of rain and it's cold, we get tundra, or basically frozen permafrost. Where it rains a lot and it's hot, we get tropical rainforest. When it rains a decent amount, but it's not that hot, we get temperate rainforest. Temperate rainforest. When it doesn't rain as much, we get a tropical forest or a savanna, and we get a temperate forest. And as we get less and less rain, but we have these kind of more acceptable temperatures, we got temperate forest, and then we have woodlands where it's a lot of grass, but still some trees, and then we get shrublands, and then we get grasslands. So as we get less rain, we just get smaller organisms. We go from big, huge trees to good-sized trees to a few trees, but now a bunch of shrubs, to just grasses, because that's what we can tolerate because of the amount of precipitation that we're getting. And so it's just important to be able to understand how important just the amount of rain and how hot it is can really determine what grows in an area. So just to give you the idea of some communities within California, so this graphic here, we talked about the rain shadow effect. So looking at going from the coast in Northern California over to the Sierra Nevadas, we have a redwood community. As we go up in elevation, we get a Douglas fir community. We come back down in elevation, we get the oak woodlands in the foothills. We got our valley grassland. We get our oak woodlands again in the foothills. And then as we go up the Sierra Nevadas, we have a pine community, then a mixed conifer community, then a fir community, then we have our subalpine community, and then it happens again. So we get these communities, and we've kind of picked dominant species to label those communities, but that's just the one dominant species within that community. But there's a lot of different species all intermixed there, working together to make that community and that part of the ecosystem function. And so just to give you an idea of what California as a whole looks like, and then with some focus on the Sierra Nevada mountains, because the Sierra Nevada mountains are an amazing place when considering the whole world. It's really an amazing spot for biodiversity and for studying ecology, and so it's kind of something that I like to focus on. I notice I do. Oops, let's go back real quick. I have a hyperlink right here that you can that takes you to forest inventory and analysis data for U.S. forests to just kind of let you see some of the other data that's out there. But this is how we would break California up into different communities. And so for our Central Valley, the area that we're at down here, you can see mostly ag lands surrounded by some grasslands, and then oak woodlands, and then up into the Sierra Nevadas in terms of mixed conifer. But we also have some juniper and chaparral areas if we go to our south towards like the Los Padres National Forest. So let's also then talk about the trees, because I know this is forest ecology and we've been talking about all these other things that affect the trees, but then we need to understand the trees themselves too. So we're going to go into more detail about some of these things when we get to the dendrology portion of the class, but just to kind of go over the basics, we got a crown of a tree. So where the branches and the leaves are, that's the crown. The trunk is below that, and then we've got the roots usually underneath the ground. We've got inner bark and sapwood, or xylem and phloem. And we're going to talk about the importance of that. And just these pictures, I think, are really great in giving you detail about what exactly is going on with this tree. Usually we start with a big old taproot, get some lateral roots that gives us a nice strong trunk, and then we get our crown. Quick note, when we have a forest and we have a bunch of crowns of trees, that's called a canopy. But when we just have one individual tree with a crown, we call it a crown. So it's a tree has a crown, but a forest has a canopy. So let's start from the top down with our tree physiology. So the crown of the tree, that's where we're going to get our branches, our twigs, and our leaves. On the leaves, we'll also have stomata. So stomata are pores on the leaf that are open to allow for gas exchange. So that's how the CO2 from the atmosphere comes in to the leaf, and then it expels the O2 and stores that carbon. And so on the twigs and branches, there's lenticels which do the same thing, but on a leaf, it's stomata. In our crown, that's where we get photosynthesis occurring. So that's where we get our water, our carbon dioxide, and our sunlight to combine to give us our sugar, our energy, and our oxygen. And so the crown is actually the tree's food factory. This is where all the energy is being made. And so it's important to understand, because the crown is providing all the energy for the tree. And so that's also why the tree some of the trees want to grow in terms of those shade intolerant trees, because they want to keep growing. So they want to keep photosynthesizing. So they want to get as much sunlight as possible, as much air as possible. So they want to get up above all those other trees. Now, if we take it all the way down to the roots, okay, the roots anchor the tree and absorb the water. 90% of the roots are found in the upper 3 feet of soil, so it's not going to be very deep in the soil. And we talked about that before when we talked about the soil. We mentioned about how important the organic layer and the topsoil are going to be, because the roots don't really penetrate down much farther than that. What's interesting to know about roots that a lot of people don't think about is usually the roots are going to extend 2 to 3 times the crown width. So when you look at a tree and you look at the crown width, take that width and extend it out 2 or 3 times, and that's your root width. All right, so the middle part of the tree, the trunk, stem, or bole. You'll hear me use those terms. They're interchangeable. The trunk is important because it circulates the water and the energy or sugar from photosynthesis throughout the tree. And it does that through 2 different components. So you have xylem or sapwood. That xylem is going to carry water up from the roots. Whereas phloem, or your inner bark, that carries the sugar down from the crown through the tree and then into the soil as well. So you got xylem carrying water up and phloem carrying the sugar down. You also have the bark, which is used as protection around the trunk, and it also reduces moisture loss and then protects the tree from damage, disease, cold, heat, and fire. So what does the tree need to be a successful tree and to be healthy within a forest? It needs sunlight because it needs to do photosynthesis. It needs to be able to convert the sunlight into sugar and energy. And then that tree is going to use that energy to grow. And then that, of course, then leads to the competition for light. And not only competition between the trees, but we talked about even competition within the tree. Mentioned it before, the idea of some trees self-pruning or losing their lower limbs to be able to support the limbs higher up. The trees also need water, nutrients, and air. And so minerals and essential nutrients, they're going to get those from the soil and from organic matter. And then 95% of the water that a tree needs is actually just used to cool the tree off and to keep the leaves cool so that they can keep photosynthesizing. So it's interesting because you think of a tree needing water just like people need water, but you don't think of the idea that it's just the majority of it's just used to cool the leaves. It's not needed for any nutritional purposes. It's there just to keep the tree cool and at a proper temperature. So now we kind of understand our basics of our tree, but now we know that we have all these trees together in a forest. And so because we have all these trees together, they're going to compete. Some of them are going to compete a lot harder. Some of them are going to wait and bide their time and compete later. But there's going to be competition. And so let's define competition and let's understand what competition is. And so competition is the simultaneous demand by 2 or more organisms for limited environmental resources such as nutrients, living space, or light. And light becomes the really important one for trees, but nutrients and living space are also definitely important. Some trees are going to become big and strong. Some trees will not. Some trees are going to die out. Trees are vicious. Trees are not worried about the other trees' feelings. Trees are just going to go out there and do what they need to do to survive. And that's always an interesting thing because competition is how a lot of things are decided in the ecosystem. So being the biggest, the strongest, the fastest is important. And if not, then you really have to find another way just like those shade tolerant trees have done in terms of learning how to grow in a different way and how to use their leaves in a different way in order to make up for not being the biggest, the strongest, and the fastest. There are two types of competition, so it's always easy to think about this tree versus that tree, but that's only one type of competition, and that would be interspecific competition. So inter, I-N-T-E-R. That's competition between two different species. But then you also have intraspecific competition. So I-N-T-R-A, intraspecific competition, which is competition between two members of the same species. So if we're thinking about a forest, I can have a redwood tree and a pine tree and an oak tree, and all three of those species are competing for light and nutrients and living space and water and all that. That's interspecific competition, different species competing with each other. But I can also have a plantation of just all pine trees, nothing but the same species of pine tree, but they're still competing for nutrients, living space, water, and light. So you can have interspecific between different species competition and also intraspecific competition between the same species. And so if you get a dense forest with a lot of different types of trees, the Sierra Nevada would be a good example of this because we have mixed conifer forests. So a lot of cone-bearing trees, but not always the same species of tree. So a dense mixed conifer forest could be a great example of interspecific competition where you get all those different species competing for those limited resources. And so because we have competition in our basic understanding of ecology, we're going to try and understand that by talking about crown classification. And the crown class is the position of an individual tree within the forest canopy. And so crown class is going to be a function of tree vigor. So how good is that tree growing? How much space does that tree have to grow? And how much access to sunlight does that tree have? And all of those are influenced by stand density, how many trees are in one area, and the species shade tolerant. Are we talking about shade intolerant trees? Or are we talking about shade tolerant trees that are going to take their time? And so there's going to be 5 specific types of crown classes that we talk about. We're going to talk about dominant trees, codominant trees, intermediate trees, suppressed trees, and then we'll also talk about wolf trees. So those are going to be our 5 crown classifications. So dominant trees, these are trees where their crowns usually extend up above the general canopy. And so if I look at this graphic right here, I can see that right here where the top of the canopy is, these trees right here, these 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, those are all at the top of the canopy and up above it. So these ones are going to get light here and here and here and here and all the way around their crown. They can get light. And that's how we decide that a tree is a dominant one. Now, these trees usually have the largest and fullest crowns within the stand. Now, codominant trees, these are the ones labeled C on this graph, they usually make up the general level of the canopy. So you can see these ones right here, that's where if there was hundreds of these trees, there'd be a lot more C's than there are D's. The dominant ones, you'll get a few poking up above the general level of the canopy. With the codominants, you just get a lot of trees that are right about the same height. Those are the ones that are going to be codominant. They make up the majority of the canopy. They're going to receive sunlight from above, but they might not get it in all directions on the sides. And so that's the difference between dominant and codominant. Dominant's going to get light all the way around. Codominant will get light from above, but not from the sides. So then if we've classified the first two by their light levels, probably going to do that for same for the rest of them. And so with our intermediate trees, see the ones with the eye right here, they're going to maybe receive some sunlight from above, but definitely not any sunlight from the sides. And so they end up in the subordinate position. They're usually not up with the rest of the trees in the canopy. They're either kind of right below or trying to poke their way into the general level of the canopy. That's why they're intermediate. And then we have suppressed trees. So these are our S's down here. And suppressed trees are, I always like to put the example of the Charlie Brown Christmas tree for the suppressed tree. These are the trees that receive no light. They are below the general level of the canopy. They're usually short, sparse, narrow, and a lot of suppressed trees end up as mortality, which is the M here, and end up dying because of the competition put on them by the other trees. It depends. Sometimes you can have a suppressed tree, if it's shade tolerant, then it's just waiting for these trees to die out, and then eventually once they give it a hole and there's some sunlight, then it'll grow up and take over this area. Or if it's the same shade intolerant tree as these ones before it, then it's going to just become mortality and die out. Our last category is the wolf tree, which was the W on that previous graphic, and you can kind of see an example of a wolf tree here. The wolf trees usually get the crown being full length. See the difference between this dominant tree here in terms of its crown and the wolf tree's crown. You usually end up with, because you're getting sunlight all around, because you're kind of off on your own by yourself or on the edge of a stand, you're getting so much sunlight that you get crown growing all the way down. You get full light. These trees end up being aesthetically pleasing or really good for wildlife, but they're very poor if we're trying to actually use the tree in terms of forest production, like if we're trying to get lumber out of it, sort of a thing, because we get a nice bowl right here where we can cut a lot of logs out of this dominant tree. But this wolf tree, with all these branches and twigs going all the way to the ground, is not going to produce nice straight boards of lumber for us. The other thing about it is, too, these trees don't have to try as hard because they're in full light, so they're not going to grow. A lot of wolf trees will grow a little bit fatter than they will trying to still win that race to the sun. And so the last real important ideas to put together for this forest ecology lecture is the idea of forest development. So now that we've talked about all the factors that influence the trees, and we talked about the basics of how the trees, the basic parts of the trees, and then now we've talked about how the trees compete against each other. How does that all play out together? How does that all work as a forest? And that's what succession is. Succession is the replacement of one community of organisms, plant and animal, by another in an orderly and predictable manner following a disturbance. So succession is a pattern of plant development. So we are going from pioneer species that show up at the beginning, all the way to climax species that are going to be there till the end of the pattern. And so nothing in the ecosystem happens on accident. It's all part of these patterns of development. And so succession is that pattern for forest development. But hopefully in your head you're saying, well, yeah, but if that's the case, why doesn't everything look the same? Well, it's because of microclimates and local climates and different patterns in wind and weather, and different that lead to then different soil types, and then the different soil types lead to different species growing there, and then different wildlife being able to inhabit those areas. And all of a sudden, all that variation makes it look like it's a random pattern, but it's not a random pattern. It's it's one specific pattern, but because the pattern also can be at different times and have all these different variables, it ends up looking like it's a random pattern. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Let's then talk about the idea of disturbance, because we said that succession is what happens after a disturbance. So what's a disturbance? A disturbance is a relatively discrete event in time that's going to disrupt the ecosystem. A forest fire is usually the easiest example for most people to go that they understand in terms of a disturbance. Other ones can be insect outbreaks and tornadoes, hurricanes, anything that comes in and kind of disturbs or disrupts the ecosystem and changes things. Usually disturbances are going to open up the forest canopy and allow more light into an area. That's going to allow for establishment of new plants. These areas can be attractive to wildlife. And so really understanding disturbance and succession is really going to help foresters and forest practices really try and help them with their management to get it to really mimic as close as it can these disturbance and succession patterns. So there's lots of different types of disturbances. So wildfire, insects, logging, drought, hurricanes, wildfire, all sorts of different things that happen in different places. And so you can see here for the Western United States, animal disturbances, disease disturbances, fire disturbances, human disturbances are logging or are moving into the forest, insect disturbances, and weather disturbances. Lots of different types of disturbances. So that takes us into our secondary succession. So secondary succession, talked about it slightly earlier, the regeneration of a living community after a major disturbance. This occurs in areas where a previous community once existed, but a disturbance set succession back to an early serial stage. Secondary succession happens in areas that have soil already. If they didn't have soil, it'd be called primary succession, where we just start from bare rock. But most places on this planet now already have soil. So really, when we talk about succession, we're talking about secondary succession. And this is what we're talking about. The idea that we start off, let's just say we had a fire. And so if we have a fire, well, the first things that come back are annual plants. And so we get our annual plants. Then after a couple of years, we get some perennial plants. Then somewhere, maybe 10 years down the road, maybe 25 years down the road, we start getting small trees and shrubs. And then eventually we get bigger trees. And then eventually we get have a mature forest. And we go all the way from pioneer species out to our climax community. And while all this is happening, we're still getting this seasonal growth every year. And so it's really this idea that there's this pattern where we go from grasses and smaller organisms and work our way up to bigger organisms the longer the time that those organisms have to grow. And so climax community or species is just our final stage of succession. So whatever species is going to be there at the end is our climax species. And so here's kind of a nice summary of the idea of forest succession. So we get, usually in forests, we start off with grasses and plants in the first 5 years. We get shrubs and then small trees 6 to 25 years. The next 50 years, we got a young forest. 50 to 150 years, we got a mature forest, and a climax or old growth forest is what we get when these trees get to be over 150 years old. So when you start thinking about that and you start saying, okay, well now let's think about the United States and the history of it. How many forests do we have that are over 150 years old or over 200 years old or over 300 years old that people haven't touched? And you start thinking about it and you go, okay, well it's the year 2020, so let's take away 300 years, so 1720. So before we've got our our colonies and before we're even in the United States. So we're talking about forests that would be that old, and there's not many of those. So we've gone through succession in almost every place in the U.S. And so now let's start thinking about those disturbances. So out here in California, it's a lot of wildfire. Back in the Northeast and on the eastern seaboard of the U.S., a lot of that disturbance was human-caused disturbance. So a lot of logging and a lot of city building and urbanization. In the West, lots of insects and disease and those sorts of things. So there's lots of different disturbances that then will take it from either climax forest or maybe even it only gets to mature forest, and it will knock it back to this plant stage. And if you think about the way lots of people think about the idea of doing forestry, they think about the idea of logging as clear cutting. Well, what is clear cutting? Clear cutting is just the starting over of this succession pattern. So you have a mature forest of trees where they've reached maturity and they've grown up and they're at their mature point. So we're going to cut them all down. We're going to take it back to this phase, and then we're going to let them grow up again. That's the idea of taking what we know about ecology and what we understand about ecology and then applying it to management. Now, the other pattern of development that we have is just specifically a stand of trees. So we have our overall forest goes through succession, but you can have individual stands of trees, and this is really typical for when you're doing plantation forestry. So plantation forestry is slightly different. That's when we're really managing the forest. But this pattern happens in both when we're just in nature and then also when we're really managing the forest. But it's usually seen much easier when we're doing intensive management of the forest. And there's 4 stages of stand development. There's stand initiation, stem exclusion, understory reinitiation, and then the old growth phase. Stand initiation, that's when the plants are just getting established and they're growing and they're trying to figure out who's the biggest and the strongest. You get to stem exclusion. Now all of a sudden, this is when trees start really developing their crowns. So we get that crown competition, figuring out who's going to be dominant, who's going to be co-dominant, and who's going to be intermediate, suppressed, and maybe die out. And so once those trees die out, now there's some light and openings for other trees. So now we get what we call understory reinitiation, where you've got some trees that have established themselves in the canopy, but now you've got these other spots where now other trees are going to try and work their way into the canopy. Maybe some shade tolerant trees find their way in at that point. And then you get the old growth phase, where the older trees are dying off, new ones are appearing, and kind of what most people think of as a typical forest. And this is what development looks like in a natural forest. So you've got your stand, so we got open ground, and all of a sudden we get young trees. Those young trees can then grow together, and they're going to figure out who's going to be dominant, who's going to be co-dominant, who's going to be intermediate or suppressed. And some of these trees are going to die out. If we look over here and we see, oh, some of those trees didn't make it. Well, that's fine, because that opens up holes to then let these trees now try and work their way up into the canopy. And eventually we'll get this mixture of trees growing together. And how do we get to open ground? Well, let's take it back to that idea of succession. We have some sort of a disturbance that happens that resets the pattern and allows us to then go through the pattern of succession again. So here's trying to put that idea of succession and stand development together. So we have our time since disturbance. So here's our disturbance. So we've just gotten past disturbance. So we get our establishment or our stand initiation. Then we get our stem exclusion, where we're trying to fight to see who's going to be the biggest and the strongest. Then we get our understory reinitiation, and then we get our old growth phase. And then if we get to old growth, that means we haven't had a disturbance for a long time. But usually what happens is somewhere in this mature phase, we end up having a disturbance and we go all the way back to here. Because usually if we get to this old growth phase, that's where we get to our climax community, and that's where we get a lot of shade tolerant trees that aren't going to allow for shade intolerant trees to grow up. And so if you get sometimes to this old growth phase, to this climax community stage, you're not getting disturbances anymore because these trees have kind of established themselves and they want to stay there. And unless you get a disturbance, it's not going to go back on its own. You need that disturbance to happen in order for it to reset itself. Just giving you another look at kind of that same idea of the idea of stem stand initiation, stem exclusion, understory reinitiation, and then the old growth phase. And then this figure right here, I think is really interesting. So it's the idea of looking at succession and looking at stand development, but then looking at it through the eye of wildlife habitat. So when it's younger and you've got this new clear cut and you got just this grass and shrub and young forest phase, deer forage supplies are huge. Deer love this because if you see our deer right here and you see its height, it's perfect. A lot of this stuff is good forage, things that we want to eat. So it's great. But then as these trees get bigger and start shading out the stuff here, and we get to something like our stem exclusion phase, all of a sudden we don't have a lot of forage supplies. And it's not until we hit that maturity phase and that old growth that we really start having those open pockets where we can then get some of the shrubs and some of these grasses growing back in underneath again, that the deer are happy again. So that's our lecture for forest ecology. I know there's a lot in there, but forestry is definitely a science, definitely has a lot to it, and I hope you're enjoying stuff so far.